This is our lecture video on the Southern Colonies of the British Colonies. In this lecture, you'll learn about the geography, economy, government, and society of the Southern Colonies region of the 13 British colonies. At the end of this lecture, you need to be able to locate the colonial region and identify the colonies included in it, describe the geographic features of the region, describe the economy, government, and society of the region, and explain the impact of key individuals on the development of the region. So here's the 13 colonies. The region of the Southern Colonies included the colonies of Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. On this map here, it's this area that is in green. When we look at the geography of the Southern Colonies, the land itself was very fertile and it was ideal for agriculture. Throughout the landscape, there were forests, swampy areas, and wide coastal plains, which were also suited to agriculture. The main water features included a very long coastline, but the coastline itself had few natural harbors for ships, and what you're going to see is very few coastal ports are going to open up in this area. The main ones end up being Baltimore, Williamsburg, and Jamestown, Savannah, Georgia, and also Charleston, South Carolina. The climate of this area was very warm. The winters were short, which provided a very long growing season, which also made the region suited to agriculture. It's very humid with lots of rain, so good for growing crops. If we take a look at the early settlements in this area, the first permanent settlement was founded in Virginia at a place called Jamestown. This ends up being the first permanent British settlement in North America. There was an earlier British settlement, a place called Roanoke Island off the coast of North Carolina, but the settlers that were there sort of mysteriously vanished, were never heard from again. A supply ship came and couldn't figure out what happened to all the colonists that were there. So Jamestown's the first permanent settlement, the first successful one. This colony did very poorly at first. It started with their choice of a location. They settled on the James River in Virginia, and they sailed upriver about 50 miles. They were trying to find a spot that would provide them defense from the Spanish, who were also looking to colonize in this area. And they chose a swamp for its defensive reasons, but by being in proximity to the swamp, it also made diseases much more prevalent, especially malaria. So the settlers ended up getting very sick because many of them didn't have resistance to that disease. It started off, many of these settlers refused to work. A lot of them, they came assuming they were going to get rich quick and they were going to find gold just like the Spanish had, things like that. And none of that really materializes. John Smith is going to take over leadership of this colony in 1608. He's going to make some very important changes that help make the colony a little more stable. He's going to build a defensive fort to protect the settlement from both Native Americans and the Spanish. Then he starts making treaties with the Native Americans who were nearby. The British had a tendency to attack and raid the Native American villages and basically steal food and supplies from the Indians. Making some treaties and peace with them, they could trade for the food instead. He also put rules in place that made settlers have to work in order to earn food, and if they chose not to work, then they faced harsh punishments. Smith continued to lead the colony for a couple years and then left for Britain. There was a lack of supplies by the years 1609 and 1610, which led to a period of time that the people of Jamestown referred to as the starving time. Only about 60 of the original 214 settlers survived this time. They actually had the intention of leaving. They were leaving on a ship because they hadn't gotten any resupplies, and as the boat was moving out, they saw the supply ship come in, so people went back. And the colony ended up being successful because a man named John Rolfe is going to bring in a new form of tobacco from the West Indies. He's going to harvest this tobacco in 1614, and then tobacco is going to become the principal cash crop of the colony. and all the landowners in the colony start to grow tobacco to sell it. Tobacco at the time became very popular in Europe. Tobacco was something that was native to the Americas, and it was a new thing in Europe. So this gave the colony a way to generate money and be successful. He's also known for marrying Pocahontas, who was the daughter of Chief Powhatan, who was the leader of a confederation of Indian tribes. She had actually been kidnapped by the British, and while she was being held hostage by the British is when she got married. There's some disputes about whether she was really a cooperative bride or whether she was forced into this marriage by the British. The marriage, though, did lead to an uneasy peace between the English settlers and the Indians. It's not going to last forever, though. Eventually they're going to go to war with one another again, and the British are going to end up winning. If we look at the economy of the Southern Colonies, it's going to be very similar to some of the things that we looked at with the Spanish colonies in the New World. The economy is going to be dominated by plantation agriculture, and these plantations are going to grow cash crops to sell at a profit. These crops would either be sold in the colonies, but more likely they would be shipped back to Britain and then sold by merchants there. The primary cash crops that you see in the Southern Colonies at this time, tobacco was the most common and the most successful, but you also saw rice and indigo production in Georgia and South Carolina. Indigo was a blue dye that was used. The system of plantation agriculture required large amounts of labor. This is a time before the Industrial Revolution. There aren't machines to do the labor on these farms, and tobacco production, for example, was very labor intensive. There weren't enough settlers who were moving to this land to hire workers. So the first means to deal with the labor shortage were indentured servants. Indentured servants were people who were usually poor. They were European. They would agree to a 3 to 7 year term of service to work to pay off their passage across the Atlantic, because it was very expensive at that time to travel across the Atlantic. For all intents and purposes, they would be property. They would be owned kind of like slaves. The difference between an indentured servant and a slave, though, is the indentured servant, there would be a time when their term of service would end, whereas the slave is going to be held in bondage probably for their entire life. When there weren't enough indentured servants being used, the British are going to look to use African slaves. Slavery already, at this point, had a long history in the New World, with the Spanish using slave labor, and also the Portuguese in their colony of Brazil using slaves. So there was already a trade and slaves going back and forth across the Atlantic. The first slaves were brought into Jamestown in the year 1619. And it's going to start this large influx of slaves that's going to continue. Really, it continues all the way until the slave trade is made illegal in the 1820s. By 1770, some colonies, like Georgia and South Carolina, actually had more slaves than free people in their colonies. This economic system that existed in the Southern Colonies really discouraged the growth of cities. The few cities that were there mainly served as ports so that goods could be put onto ships and shipped out. The population itself is going to stay very spread out in the countryside because most of them were farmers. Tobacco itself was very hard on the soil and depleted the soil. So these large plantation owners continually sought access to more and more land, and that's going to drive expansion westward. That westward expansion is going to end up leading to conflicts with Native Americans who were living there, because the Native Americans had access to more land, and the British wanted to take the land from them so they could grow more tobacco. Most of the governments in the Southern Colonies were royal colonies. Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and eventually Georgia. A royal colony is a colony where it is ruled directly by the English monarchy. The monarchy would usually appoint governors who would oversee the colony, even if the colony had its own legislature to make laws. In Virginia, the House of Burgesses was founded in Jamestown in 1619. This is the first elected legislature in North America. It was a two-house legislature. The House of Burgesses was the lower house. Those were the guys that were elected. In order to vote for a burgess, you had to own a certain amount of land. So it wasn't the universal democracy. You had to have land, you had to have property, you had to be a man, you had to be white. But it was the closest to democracy that had existed in the Americas at that time. It's ironic that both democracy and slavery start in the British colony of Jamestown in the exact same year, 1619. There were also some proprietary colonies in the Southern Colonies. A proprietary colony is a colony where the monarch granted control of the land in the colony to an individual or a small group. Maryland was one of these. A British nobleman by the name of George Calvert, and then later his son Cecilius Calvert. They were both known as Lord Baltimore. George was Lord Baltimore I, Cecilius was Lord Baltimore II. They founded Maryland as a refuge for English Catholics. They were Catholic, and in Britain, Catholics were being persecuted because they had different religious beliefs from the Anglican Church, that was the state church in England. So Maryland would be a place where those religious dissenters could go and live and practice their religion. Now, not just Catholics end up migrating to Maryland. Both Protestants and Catholics migrate there, and conflicts develop between the Catholics and the Protestants in Maryland, and that is going to lead to Maryland passing the Toleration Act of 1649. That Toleration Act made Maryland the second colony to have freedom of religion after Rhode Island. Georgia was also a proprietary colony at first. It was founded by James Oglethorpe in 1732. And his vision for the colony was that it would be a place for debtors, that's people that owed money. Back then, if you owed a lot of money and you couldn't pay your debts, they threw you in prison. It's a little different than now. It was a place for debtors that had been jailed in England to get a fresh start. They could, instead of serving out their term in prison there, they would go to Georgia. They'd get a small amount of land so that they could work and support themselves. He set up a lot of laws that restricted wealthy, large landowners from coming to dominate the colony the way that they had in places like Virginia and the Carolinas. This is eventually going to make this wealthy aristocracy upset, and they're going to put pressure on the British government to take over the colony, which is what's going to happen in 1752, and that's when Britain is going to make Georgia a royal colony. The economic system of the plantations is really going to drive the development of the society in the Southern Colonies. One of the ways that lots of rich colonists were encouraged to settle there was a system in Virginia called the headright system. And because they had so few settlers that were moving there, the government of Virginia, the Virginia Company, was offering land to every person that came from England. And the way the system worked is you got 50 acres of land if you came, but you also get 50 acres for every person you brought with you or every person you paid for. This really benefited rich colonists and settlers because they could bring their family, their servants, their slaves, and for each one of those people that they brought and paid for, they got another 50 acres of land. What's going to happen with this is a small amount of very rich landowners are going to come to dominate society populated in large part by very poor white farmers and slaves. These plantation owners, they controlled both the government and the economy. Since poor people had little say in the government, it led to revolts like Bacon's Rebellion that we're reading about, lots of slave revolts. Most of the people that lived in this area were Anglican Protestants, with the exception of the Catholics that were living in Maryland. So in terms of religious beliefs, this is an area that's fairly unified in what they believe in.